It's Pride Month, but not everyone has reason to celebrate. A number of countries in West Africa have recently adopted tough anti-LGBTQ legislation, punishing same-sex relations with heavy jail sentences, and in some cases, even the so-called promotion of LGBTQ activity, which could see advocates jailed simply for talking about these issues. Niger and Ghana are among the latest countries to pass such laws, but there's evidence the policies weren't entirely homegrown, and were instead shaped by international lobbying. Our question today: how are US Christians meddling in African LGBTQ and reproduction laws, and why? Let's bring in Haley McEwen, who spent years documenting the emergence of anti-feminist and anti-gender diplomacy. She's written a book about the American Christian right taking aim at LGBTQ rights, sex education, and gender rights in Africa.
I am a researcher, and I've been conducting research on the global activities of the U.S. Christian right for about 10 years.
The global activities of the US Christian right. This isn't a new phenomenon. Haley says US Christian activist groups have been working to influence the politics of gender and sexuality in African countries since the early 2000s. We're going to look into exactly why and what exactly these groups are doing, whilst debunking a few myths along the way. There's a narrative that Africa is resistant to LGBTQ and gender rights, for example, but Haley says this isn't just an African issue.
We can see that this is not an Africa-only trend, and that rather what we're seeing in African countries is part of a wider transnational anti-gender movement, and we can see the same actors promoting the same narratives, the same discourses across these very diverse parts of the world.
So who are the actors, and what is that discourse?
There's reports, for example, by Open Democracy and the Institute for Journalism and Social Change, which show that U.S. Christian right organizations have spent millions, hundreds of millions of dollars over the past 10, 15 years in supporting the growth of movements against sexual and reproductive rights, against LGBTI rights. They've convened several conferences, supported the convening of several conferences on the continent in recent years. There have been online campaigns that carry the logos of U.S. Christian right organizations that have circulated around the continent. We've seen them make physical appearances at the conferences, which I've mentioned, in which they are rubbing shoulders with politicians in the highest levels of government, including heads of state.
Let's have a look at a recent example. As I mentioned at the beginning, Ghana just passed an anti-LGBTQ law in Parliament. Now, the Ghanaian president said that the law will undergo scrutiny before it's officially approved, but it is the second time that such legislation has been backed by MPs. Ghana also hosted the so-called Fourth African Interparliamentary Conference on Family, Sovereignty and Values. My colleague in Accra spoke to lawmakers there from several countries about what the conference is about for them.
Some systems have come up and pushed some of their traditions and values back. It is time we are rising again and saying that, look, these ideals and values about African society are equally important and must be respected. As simple as that.
It's not about denying anybody, it's about protecting ourselves. Protecting myself is different from denying you from doing what you can do what you're doing, but I'm also get it right to protect myself. So we are doing it for our family. I think African family.
It is actually vying well with our African concept, our African culture, our African rules. So while we are not, as parliamentarians, speaking against the others, but we would like to advocate for what is real for Africa.
We heard the Malawian lawmakers stressing that the traditional family is very much an African project. But is it? We know that a foreign Christian group, the Christian Council International, was allowed to address the assembly. And Haley says that the nuclear family ideal that's now being promoted at this conference and elsewhere isn't really an African ideal at all.
There is ample evidence refuting this idea that the nuclear family is in any way authentically African. And rather, research shows us that the idea of the gender binary, the gender hierarchy, and the nuclear family as an institution were part of the colonial project of conquest and domination, and of dismantling indigenous knowledge systems and colonial structures. So actually, it's this idea of the nuclear family being this universal kind of kinship style is itself a colonial ideological construction. And we are seeing it now return in the 21st century. And that makes us need to interrogate what are the geopolitical interests? What are the global power relations at stake in this agenda? And why is so much money invested in something and needed to invest in something that is supposedly natural, right? If it's natural, why does it need so much money to institutionalize, normalize, and defend it?
All right, it's time for the multi-million-dollar question. Why are US Christian groups meddling in what's essentially domestic policies? Why do they care how Africans live their lives?
They're not only interested in changing the national laws in African countries. If we look at what US Christian right groups are doing at the UN level, we can see that a big element of their work in African countries is to gain allies to join them in trying to overturn the UN framework's agreed consensus language around things like sexual and reproductive health and rights, the recognition of gender beyond the binary, the recognition that there's multiple forms of family, and this is something they're really fighting against at the UN. And the Africa group has become now increasingly involved in these agendas, right, to challenge the stuff at the UN level.
In summary, US Christian groups are trying to influence African policymakers in order to change global law. And it's not just American Christians who are lobbying for these traditional family values. Haley says groups from the Netherlands, Poland, and the UK now regularly send lobbyists and advisors to Africa. That group that addressed the conference in Ghana, the Christian Council International, is Dutch. But Haley also says that not all countries across the continent are headed in the same direction.
So in South Africa, we have seen some positive developments and leadership by the government to reject these discriminatory agendas. But that doesn't mean that South Africa is kind of free or safe from the efforts of these pro-family lobby groups. At the last Pan-African Conference on Family Values that was held in Nairobi in 2025, they announced that the next conference will take place in Cape Town in 2027. So I think South Africa, because it has taken such a strong stance towards inclusion, it's a particular point of interest for these groups, because if they can get South Africa on side, then they've really kind of reached a tipping point in terms of being able to roll this out and gain legitimacy for these agendas. But I think in South Africa, we have a very strong civil society that has been working to defend rights for decades, and people are aware of who is behind these lobbying efforts and these transnational campaigns. And I think as awareness, not only in South Africa, but elsewhere on the continent, as awareness grows that this is actually a imported transnational campaign. It's not grassroots or homegrown. You know, it's very much funded by far-right groups elsewhere in the world. I think people are starting to realize that this is not something that they want for their societies or for their communities or for their families.
As Pride Month continues, this is a reminder that the politics of gender and sexuality are rarely just local. They're shaped by a much wider, often well-funded transnational network. And as Haley's research shows, that network reaches far beyond Africa's borders. Have you seen this kind of lobbying play out in your country? Please let us know in the comments below. I'm Hannah Hummel in Berlin. Thank you so much to Haley McEwen and to my producers Nina Tietzel, Jason Murtock, and Till Boller.